So, hi everyone, welcome to our first event of this quarter of our research unit, Comics More Than Words. So today we have Pablo Guerra. The topic for this quarter is gonna be comic theory. So let me introduce you a little bit. Pablo Guerra. Pablo Guerra is a comic book creator and comic book critic, historian, like you, like editor, like you work around comics in so many ways. From Colombia. So Pablo is an expert in the history of Colombian comics. He's probably like the person who first started like writing that history, and like Pablo is also like an amazing comic creator. I told him like a couple of years ago that I first like I first knew of his work when I was an undergrad, and he was writing comics back then. We come from the same school, like we did our undergrad in Universidad de los Andes. But when I was an undergrad, Pablo had already graduated. But by that time, he started producing comics, and so that was a comic that like one of the first comics that I read like while I was an undergrad, and within a literature department was a comic that Pablo created on plagiarism. I guess it was, but it was a very good topic.
Nice.
And Pablo had been also a guest speaker at like a couple times at the class that I have taught on Spanish through comics. Uh, so that's kind of my informal introduction. I'm very happy to have always Pablo here. And I don't know, like anything you want to say, Pablo?
Oh, thank you so much, Christian, for that introduction, that heartfelt introduction. It brings back a lot of memories. Yeah, it's been like a couple of decades of work on how to make comics a reality in Colombia. Uh, this is a very small industry, and 20 years ago it was even smaller. So that means you have to really do a lot of things. You listen? Okay. Um, so yeah, I had to learn not only the real thing that I wanted to do, that was writing. I also had to learn how to edit, and I realized also I had to learn uh, a lot more about the history of Colombian comics. I think Christian, you can start showing the presentation, because yeah, I realized that in order for me to have a voice as a creator, I had to first figure out who came before me, what happened before me. Um, and I've been reflecting on this issue a lot lately, because next year, the first Colombian comic book character will turn 100 years old, which was Mohicon. And I mean, when the art or your art, the thing you want to do, turns 100, you feel it's time to reflect, and it's time to think, where are comics now? Where are they going? And I have to say that part of that reflection has, I don't know. I had to face the fact that I haven't, like, in reality, these 100 years of comics have been really difficult, and for example, in terms of research, there's so much to be done. There's a lot of material that has been lost, or that we know very little about, because I mean, there in the picture, that's me with the red shirt, with the red T-shirt, and the guy with the hat is another researcher called Bernardo Rincon. For a while, we sort of created like a comic club, a lost comics club. So we would meet in the National Library, and just, in our free time, and just, like look through some of the old newspapers, trying to, find those lost comics. And this sort of journey, I'm thinking about how to, encapsulate those 100 years. And I think it has to do with this idea of going from comics to comics, right? So how do we get to a place where we actually have a word that we appropriate, that we that is part of the Spanish language, which is comics, but written with an accent mark. So you can move to the next slide. So yeah, what's in a tilde, right? Usually in Spanish with the Anglicism, the academy usually, you know, advises writers to sort of stay away from Anglicisms, to try to use words in Spanish that can be, that are synonyms. But when I was naming one of my first blogs back in 2005, I kept on thinking I wanted to name it Drake Comics, because one of the comics I made at the time was called El Drake. And I just kept on thinking, should I write Drake Comics with or without the tilde? And I just went ahead and wrote it with the tilde, because I think part of this 100 years has to do with creators in Colombia appropriating a foreign medium, right? A foreign art form that is usually associated with things that are not Colombian. Within Colombia, comics are not thought of as an art form that will talk about the local issues. It's thought about as an art form from the US, basically, and lately from Japan. But I really wanted to keep that word, because I think that word sort of summarizes that particular history, and especially that accent mark. You can move to the next slide. So yeah, there's been some studies on the history of Colombian comics, usually from a perspective that sees comics as an inherently like a mass medium phenomenon that has to do with popularity, with huge sales. But in order for me to really understand the history of comics, I think it implies changing also the definition. Because if we just just study what is popular, what sells well, we will have nothing to study. It has to do with something different. We are a type of comics that are from the periphery. Thus, our definition has to be informed by that condition. You can move to the next slide. And it really has to do with a further question about the Colombian audience. Because usually, there has been historically throughout the 20th century an audience for comics, but as I was saying, for foreign comics, a huge audience, an audience that was very passionate and very invested in comics, but that just thought of the local creators as imitators, as people who just were not good enough because they didn't really manage to copy or to clone perfectly the sensibilities of creators from the US, for example. And I realized in this sort of search for my roots as a comics creator that I had to move far away from that journey, right? I had to look for something different, that sort of the Colombian superhero, or cloning some of the genres that were important in Europe or in the US or in Japan. You can move to the next one.
Oh, that's okay.
So I had to do this. I had to go backwards to move forward, and I had to really, and maybe it has to do with me being an artist, but I really felt a personal connection with different creators. It was not only about discovering their works, unveiling them from the archives.
Pablo, you're muted.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. So yeah, this is sort of like so I took some snippets of this journey from comics to comics. So I'll talk about some of those creators now. So you can move to the next slide. Okay, so the first one is Adolfo Samper. Adolfo Samper created Mohicon, which is the character that next year will turn 100. And this has to do with sort of a very biblical kind of original sin, right? Because Mohicon, as other characters from South America, was a copy of an American character. In this case, it was Smitty. The same thing happened with Paquin in Mexico. Like they also took Smitty and created a different character called Paquin. Well, in Colombia, they created Mohicon. So my first encounter with Mohicon was about sort of figuring out his source, right? So making those comparisons between the original strips by of Smithy and sort of figuring out how he copied them. Because it was not only about copying, it was also about translating and adapting the references to the Colombian and especially the reality in Bogota. In his later years, Adolfo Samper renegated of this story, of this history. He said he felt he didn't really create it, Mohicon. He was just copying it. But through the archives, I found a different story. You can move to the next slide. Because in this Lost Comics Club, we found it with Bernardo. We found this strip. This is a color strip. It's a special strip that they produced to celebrate the 4-year anniversary of the newspaper where Mohicon was published. And it features the characters, the regular characters from the series, but it also features the editor of the newspaper and Adolfo Samper himself. So there's no way he just copied this strip. There's no way he took like an American comic strip and just traced it. He had to create it by himself. In reality, I think what happened, I don't know if it's a reality or not, it's just a theory. I mean, he was learning, and the way he was learning was through copying and using this. Because when you start, looking for this meaty original strips, I also realized that he took other strips. He took Gasoline Alley and other strips to sort of complete the story. So in a way, I mean, he really was just using copying as a starting point. So you can move to the next slide. Because in reality, it has to do with a question of how do you learn comics art as an outsider. This is also a very interesting strip. This is something he created. This is Misia Escopeta, a strip he created in the 1950s. So, I mean, he started out in the 1920s. This is from the 1950s. And this character is remembering her youth. And when she remembers her youth, she talks about how she used to learn Mundo al Día, which was the newspaper where Mohicon was published. So maybe Adolfo Samper didn't have like this negative relation with his past throughout his life. Maybe it was something that, I don't know, just reflected where he was when he was in his later years. But these type of examples, this strip of Misia Escopeta also reveals that he had like good memories of the time in Mundo al Día and of making comics in Mundo al Día. You can move to the next slide. So yeah, there's this question of how do you learn as an outsider? And this was a big issue throughout the 20th century for Colombian creators. A key source of learning was mailing courses. This was promoted throughout the Colombian press. These methods of learning, they would send you, all the material through mail, and you just created your exercises, then you send them back and you got them corrected, or they would check your work, and that's how you learned. Another very important creator of Colombian comics also used this method, like he used this method. You can move to the next slide. That is Ernesto Franco. Ernesto Franco created Copetin. And it's a very interesting comic because he started publishing it in the early 1960s. At that time, the Colombian press was publishing a lot of American comics. When Mohicon started out, there were no comics being published in the Colombian press. But in the 1960s, it was already like a feature in every newspaper. So when Copetin started to be published, he was published alongside the most popular, comic strip characters of the U.S. And the thing about Copetin is that he talks about homeless children. Okay, he based this character on kids that he met when he owned a restaurant downtown Bogota, and there were a lot of kids around the restaurant who lived on the streets. So he created this character to show that reality. It was a humor character. He was trying to make you laugh, but he was really making a very dark type of humor. So when you look at Copetin, like in the middle of, I don't know, like big, extraordinary, exotic adventures of, I don't know, Tarzan, but then you also see a Blondie strip where you see like the suburban life, and you encounter this character that is talking about a very hurtful reality, a very sad reality from a humor point of view. It's really shocking. It's really interesting. The reaction of the audience was was also interesting because like everyday readers loved this character. This character was published for 30 years, but the directors of the newspaper always, I don't know, hated him. Like this was told to me by the creator himself. The people, the owners of the newspaper didn't really want him to publish Copetin because it was troublesome. But I think being troublesome in this case was a big part of its value. So you can move to the next slide. Okay, so that opens up, this topic that is big in the history of Colombian comics so far. That it has to do with thinking that comics have to have a mission, right? There's a lot of examples of comics being created to teach kids the right way of doing something, to, I don't know, do pedagogy about the history of the country. Is there a problem? Okay. Um, but I mean, those those types of comics, I think, don't really give the artist the freedom to explore what they wanted. Like it was also, I mean, it feels like a reaction to Copetin in a way, right? So it's not about showing this reality in this very, uncomfortable way. It's about sort of showing us the right way of doing things, or the Colombian history, who are the heroes, and I think that's a key part of this history. You can move to the next slide. And of course, in that, under that, in that timeline, there's very interesting cases, such as the comics created by Orlando Falsborda and the Fundación Caribe group with an artist called Julianov Chalarca, where they use this idea of comics with a mission, but the mission was to tell the stories of peasants, of the organizations, the campesino organizations in the Colombian Caribbean. So they actually sort of took the idea of the mission by the roots and just flip the game, right? So they would do like a parallel history of the economy and the politics of the area from the perspective of the peasant. So that's also, I mean, something that can look like a, like a box, can also be like, you can flip it and turn it into something positive. Next slide. Then by the 90s, like the 1990s, the Colombian comics changed a lot. because creators just got tired of looking for spaces in sort of mainstream media, and they just started out doing their own publications, but going independent, and that's also a big part of this process of sort of creating comics with the accent mark. And part of that history has to do with Acme. Um, as a teenager, I was like a first-hand witness of the development of this magazine. There was an anthology magazine that featured many different artists at the beginning from Colombia, but also from Latin America. Because I think part of that history had to do with opening up a dialogue with other traditions that were not the central traditions, that were also peripheral. So that's where you start to, have a better understanding of where your art is and what you want with your art. Next slide. And then I think just to finish up sort of this very short overview, there's the work of Power Paola, because I think she took it a step a step further. Um, the way she just, I think her work, Virus Tropical, especially the book Virus Tropical, really changed the game throughout the region. This idea that not only you can publish your own work, but when you own it and when you find, I don't know, are daring enough to be free with the power of that gives you, I don't know, this creation where you control everything. I think she took it to a different level, and I think she's a very important part in us being recognized now, and comics really having changed, and being seen in a different manner. So I think part of the celebration of 100 years of Colombian comics has to do with this change in the dynamics, and without Paola, this wouldn't have happened. And you can show the next slide. Because yeah, the idea is, so now we have to figure out how to do better research and how to set ourselves for the next 100 years, how to change things, not through just, an individual point of view, but also thinking of how to be a community of creators that can actually, I don't know, understand different points of view and different understandings, and that I can actually be stronger together. Uh, and then is the next slide, the last one, I think. So many thanks. That's the presentation. Those are the future of comics. Those are my daughters.
Thank you so much. Yeah, like thank you. I'm gonna also put up virtual plus if I can find it. But no, thank you so much. Amazing presentation. Um, we will open up like the floor for discussion, but before like going into questions, I will ask you one very quick question, and it's like, where are you right now? Like, yeah.
Good question. I'm in the Bogota's book fair. It started out today, actually. So yeah, I tried to look for a quiet spot because there's usually a lot of music in this book fair and a lot of noise. But if we have time, maybe we can do like a little tour, because this is an interesting year because there's a pavilion that was usually dedicated to like caricature, like like a portrait caricature, but now they changed the name to graphic narratives. So now I think it's featuring a lot more comics and a lot more like local comics. So that's very interesting.
Do you have a stand right now? Are you showing something?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We have a stand for Cohete Comics, which is the imprint dedicated to comics that I edit, that I manage. So yeah, we have our a stand just for Cohete Comics, and then we also have a stand of the publisher of Cohete Comics, which is Laguna Libros.
Okay, good. So I will, I don't know, I would like to know if anyone has any question for Paulo about the presentation, Comics in Colombia, comic publishing industry. Any question from the audience?